Welcome to the Retire with Peace podcast, the podcast where we help you create a fulfilling and stress-free retirement. Each week, we bring you expert advice, practical tips, and inspiring stories to help you plan and live your best retirement life. Whether you're nearing retirement or already enjoying your golden years, this podcast is here to support you every step of the way. Let's embark on this journey together and discover how to retire with peace.
Welcome back to the Retire with Peace podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dave Zaegel, and we are in the middle of a series on inherited IRAs. If you haven't listened to our previous episode, please go back and do that first. That's going to provide a lot of background for you, where we go over the three types of IRA beneficiaries and a little bit of a history on how this all came to be. So that's going to be really helpful because today we're going to dive a little bit more into the calculations. So for a brief history, remember Secure Act 1.0 back in 2019 eliminated what was known as the stretch IRA. So previously, if you inherited money, you could stretch out the required distributions over your remaining expected lifetime. No more. They capped it at 10 years at best. So that way you can no longer stretch it. You have to take it out over a 10-year period because the government wants their money. Now, when Secure Act 1.0 was put into place, it was left pretty open. They just said you have 10 years over which to take it out. The IRS came along and said, no. You still have to take required distributions. Even though we were limited to 10 years, you must take these RMDs each year. And most people said, okay, geniuses, how do we calculate this then? Because before we had lifetime expectancy tables and we would just take the required distributions over our remaining lifetime. If we have 10 years, how do we calculate this? In the meantime, there was a Secure Act 2.0 that could have specifically provided some clarification on this topic. It did not. So now it was left back into the IRS's hands to tell us how to calculate this. 5 years later, we are now in the year 2025, and this is the first year where we have the IRS rules and guidance, and we must start taking required distributions. So that's why we're going through this, and we need to understand what the calculations are. The good news is there's lots of online calculators that can help. Most of the major custodians, if you just do a search for inherited IRA calculator, they can walk you through what the calculations are if you give it the proper data. So don't feel like you have to be sitting here with a paper and pen and calculator and all the tables and know exactly how to calculate all this. It's helpful. We're going to talk about how things get calculated, but just know there's lots of online calculators that can help. Just make sure that you are on the inherited IRA calculator, not the traditional IRA calculator. So this is money that you inherited, not money that was yours to begin with. So just make sure that you have the right calculator if you're going to search for one. You need to have the inherited IRA calculator where it's asking not only for your information, but it's also going to ask for the date of birth and date of death of the person that you inherited money from. Let's dive into the key question when we talk about calculating required distributions. The key question is, did the IRA owner die before their required beginning date? So there's always an age, and right now it kind of varies, but depending on when the person passed away. I shouldn't say it varies now, it will vary in the future. But if they've hit their required minimum distribution date, then you have to start taking required distributions as the person that inherited the money. If they had not hit their required beginning distribution date, there are no required distributions under this 10-year period. So if somebody passed away at age 62 and left money to their children, they're still subject to this 10-year rule as beneficiaries, and we talked about that in the previous video. They're still subject to this 10-year rule as beneficiaries, but there's no required distributions each year. On the other hand, let's say they were 77 years old, so they're past their required beginning date on their minimum distributions each year. Now, when you inherit the money, the required distributions kick in for you over that 10-year period. So that's a key question, is did the person that passed away reach their required beginning date? If not, you do not have to take annual required distributions over the 10-year period. But if they did hit that date, now you are required to take required distributions each year over that 10-year period. So that's a key question, is did the person that passed away hit their required beginning date? Okay, now let's assume that they have hit their required beginning date. How do we calculate these required distributions? Well, the IRS kind of brought back to life an old concept, not so much a rule, more of a concept of at least as rapidly. This was kind of thought to have gone away, but they brought this back. They said, okay, you must be taking required distributions at least as rapidly as the person that you inherited the money from. So it's going to be based on single life expectancy tables. Again, you don't need to, I don't want to try to tell everybody to go messing with the tables. The online calculators will tell you what the answer is. And that's why it asks for the person's date of birth and date of death, because it's calculating, did they hit the required beginning date? It needs to know that to tell you what the required distributions are. So if they hit their required beginning date and you have to take the distributions, it's going to be at least as rapidly as they would have had to do if it were their IRA account. So you don't necessarily have to take out 10% or more each year over those 10 years. Just know that the minimum you have to take out is at least as rapidly as they would have had to take out as the IRA owner. Again, the online calculators will help give you this answer. For planning purposes, you might want to take out more each year. It's going to depend specifically on your plan. You might be better off just taking the minimum and then taking the big chunk in year 10. Conversely, you might be better spreading it out evenly. Or you might be better taking the distributions in certain years along the way. That's all going to be specific to your tax plan and understanding where you fall from a tax perspective and when it's going to be best to take the money. But the key point here is that what was their required beginning date? Did they hit that? If not, there's no minimum, but you still might want to take some depending on your tax plan, but there's no minimum required. Whereas if they have hit that required beginning date, then you are required to take some, whether you like it or not. And again, you might still say, I need to be taking out more for my own tax plan just to make sure that I'm in good shape. Now, one of the interesting things that we brought up in the previous episode is what happens when there's a younger spouse and maybe they need the money. So you pass away before your required beginning date. Your spouse inherits the money. They can just roll that money into their IRA, or they can elect to have the 10-year rule and required distributions in place. That way they can access the money without taking the early IRA withdrawal penalty. So again, just another planning item to understand we have these required distributions that may or may not need to be calculated depending on if the person hit their required beginning date. But from a planning perspective, we need to understand that if we don't take these distributions along the way, or if we only take the required distributions each year, we're probably going to have a big chunk and a big tax hit in that 10th year. So we need to be planning accordingly long term and say, okay, when should we be taking this money to benefit us most from a long-term tax perspective? It's not just about saving money this year, saving money next year. It's how do we minimize it over that 10-year period? One other key point is successor beneficiaries. So let's say grandfather passes away, leaves money to their child. I say child, it's probably going to be an adult child. They're going to leave money, let's say, to their son who's maybe in their 50s. And then that son passes away unexpectedly, leaves money to his children who are in their 30s. They are going to be subject to the 10-year payout rule no matter what, because they are designated they are beneficiaries, they're child beneficiaries of the original owner. That is the case even if the successor is a spouse. So back to this example, let's say somebody's in their 70s, they leave money to their son who's in their 50s. And then we already talked about that son leaving money to the children. That would be under the 10-year rule. The same thing would apply if they left money to their spouse, because they are a successor beneficiary. So even though, and typically what would happen is if a spouse passed away, the surviving spouse could just take the money and move it into their IRA and not have to do any payout because they're an eligible designated beneficiary, like we talked in the last video. Typically that would be the case, but because it was an inherited IRA from a parent, now that spouse is still going to be subject to that 10-year payout rules. So just a quick clarification on successor beneficiaries. When you're the third one down the line, you're still going to be subject to that 10-year rule, even if you are a spouse. I know we're covering a lot of different rules, but it's just important to know these little nuances and details to understand when are we going to be subject to this 10-year rule and what are the calculations going to be. But for today, just understand that key question is, did the person that passed away hit their required beginning date or not? And therefore, are you subject to required distributions over this 10-year window? The next level of that, which we'll talk about in the next video, is the planning for how do we map this out over 10 years to make sure that we're not getting hit with a big chunk in one or the other years. Let's spread this out and do some longer term tax planning so that way we can lessen the burden on taxes as we're taking money out of these inherited IRAs from traditional IRAs.